You look perfect. All right. Excuse me. Rick Heinrichs, production designer of Big Eyes. You've designed some fairly elaborate sets for Tim Burton films, and a lot of people are saying that this one is a departure for the director and, by an extension, your work. Do you see this as a departure at all?
Yeah, I think that people are going to a degree, see it as a departure for Tim's work because, I think that everybody likes to pigeonhole to a certain degree. And I think that everybody has a sense, or I feel that they have a sense of what Tim's work is like, based on quite a bit of his work. But I think that probably, obviously, he's working with Larry and Scott again, the writers who are actually producing this, and so in many respects, it harkens back a little bit to Ed Wood and the kind of the feeling of that. But for me, I still feel that it's very important to for people to realize that this still is very much within his own canon of films. I think that it's a biographical story. I think the fact of that means that he approaches it a certain way. But if you look at what it's about, it's about it's about a kind of an oddball artist who has their own vision of the world, working in isolation, oftentimes at odds with that world, and so many of his movies have got that as a kind of an undercurrent, a theme that runs through it. I think also that stylistically, I've worked with Tim on some of his animated films as well, and look how I think influenced to a certain degree, certainly part of the pop culture that Tim grew up in are the Big Eyes and the element that Margaret says in the film that the eyes are the windows to the soul. I think that that you can sort of see that in Tim's own work, that he had that influence as well as many others growing up. I think also, and maybe it's more subtle, but I know that at the beginning of the film, Tim and Bruno Delbonnel, the DP, and I had a lot of conversations about how we were going to approach the look and feel of the film. And color is a very important part of it. And for me, the color is expressive kind of what was going on screen. There was a bit of a development and evolution of the power between Margaret and Walter that shifted, that dynamic shifted over the course of the film, and to a degree that is also that's a visual narrative element that is supporting what we were trying to do. Tim is very sensitive to using those kind of cues in helping tell his story.
Right. Now, this story it's based on true events. So what kind of research did you do in order to prepare for it?
I didn't actually meet Margaret Keane ahead of time. I did meet her in the wrap, but she's a fairly reticent human being, and she had already had given a great deal of her story to Larry and Scott. We were also able to kind of contact her through her gallery, the owner, Robert Brown, who handled all of her affairs, and there was a kind of a line of communication there. It was interesting because I'd never worked on a film in which I had so many kind of historical documents about the life that she and Walter lived, and Jane, her daughter, as well. And it was interesting to to be dealing with something in the near past like that we just had so much non-fictional information on. There was a Life magazine article that was the pictures in it were incredibly powerful. Have you seen the film, Zach?
I have, yes.
So you know, you'll know that there's a very strong portrait of Walter, her husband, there, and you know, this is just a case where the cinematic version of this is not necessarily exaggerated compared to the original story and the truth of his character and of his personality. I'm sorry, am I answering your question?
No, you were. Yes, thank you.
No, it was enormously interesting to be. It's like an anthropological dig. Larry and Scott both had a great deal of photographic information, all the stories that she had told, which came out in their script. They hooked me up with this fantastic guy, Matthew Sweet, who's a rock and roll musician, and he and his wife are big collectors of the big-eyed art from the late 50s and early 60s, not just of Keane, but there were some other big names who did really beautiful work at that time. Mayo and Franco Azzo and Lee and Eve and people like that who were very much of that genre, not necessarily, their work wasn't a rip-off of Margaret's, although there were also a number of sort of rip-off artists who were trying to copy her style. And you know, one of the interesting side stories was, in some cases, there would be paintings out there that were attributed to her that we really did have to check with Robert and then with Margaret. And in a few cases, she said, "I didn't paint that." So you know, we had to be very careful to make sure that all the work represented was in fact Margaret's, and that she stood behind what we were putting up on screen.
Right, and it's interesting. I don't know if this was just something that I got out of it, or if this was what your intention was, but in the designs of the sets, you know, Margaret, of course, comes from a very humble beginning, and then comes up into these very lavish, expansive houses that are a result of fraud, in a sense, you know, lies on the part of her husband, Walter, who took credit for her work. And so, in a sense, she becomes more withdrawn as the film goes on and as the sets begin to expand. Was that something that was intentional, or is that just something I gleaned from it?
Well, I don't know if this answers your question. It was interesting to see that you know, Margaret wasn't an artist who would set up a studio downtown that she would go off and paint at. Her workspace was always within her house, and so part of that is a reflection of their fortunes at the time, which that was kind of convenient for us to be able to show how their fortunes were reflected in the workspace that she was in, and but a lot of the story and what you're referring to a degree, I feel like we were also trying to deal with in terms of a kind of a compression of space and in color as well. When we first meet Margaret, you know, she's escaping her suburban home. She's setting up apartment in San Francisco, and you know, we sort of were dealing with sort of bright, fresh, optimistic colors. This was all of those elements that seem to reflect her personality to us, the kind of hope for a new beginning that she was doing. When she gets together with Walter, he's a much more complicated, and in the case of the house that we selected for him, sort of a darker and more foreboding presence. And our colors for Walter were more brooding and darker and masculine, and we were kind of showing in that how his dominance was, entering her life and affecting her. And by the time they are in the mid-century modern house at the end of the film, towards the end of the film, together, once more, the light and the feel of the place is affected by Margaret's optimism and the whole look and feel of mid-century modern at the time. But there's also an aspect of it which I love, which is, as you say, built on deceit and fraud. There's an element of Walter's, I feel anyway, his kind of flights of fantasy and his unhinged reality as well. And that sets the stage for the sort of heightened crisis that happens in the film.
Right. Lastly, I just want to ask you about working with Tim Burton. You've worked together on Sleepy Hollow, Dark Shadows, Planet of the Apes, Frankenweenie. Am I leaving anything out? He's someone who has a very singular kind of vision and is, of course, known for his production design in his movies. What is your collaboration like with him?
Yeah, it's funny. Those are the films you named are the ones, the feature films that we've worked at. I've known Tim for 30 years at least. We were both at Disney together and started to work together there and develop projects together there. And we fell into a working relationship of sort of mutual development of ideas. And he's got a very strong art direction sensibility. Tim's focus is on, and always really has been on his story and characters, and how the sort of singular vision can help support that. And when I work with Tim, I find that I'm best able to support his sort of singular vision by expanding upon what I see, what I am sensing that he's going for. And there is a kind of a shorthand, if you will, of ideas that many would consider Burtonian, if that's a word. To the point of it's not so much an exchange of words as it is an exchange of, well, I want this to feel like this, and he's gotten to a point where he's not really drawing stuff out. He's occasionally doing some really quick sketches that are really all you need to get your juices going and to get the spark of an idea that you can then take and continue to develop. All these films are developed over a period of time with myself and Tim and with a very talented group of people who know where to come in and plus the process.
Right. Well, Rick, thank you so much for
pleasure.
And congratulations on the film.
Great. Thanks very much, Zach. All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care.
You too. Thank you.